start again. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to have you join me again today. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend. I'd like to talk today a little bit about my hometown, New Orleans. I have to admit, I was very lucky growing up in New Orleans. Though we lived outside, my parents had a place with about 2 acres outside, just outside of New Orleans. My grandparents lived in Uptown, and it was really very nice. I would go over there and spend time with them. And I remember my grandfather died when I was still quite young, but my grandmother lived till I was older, and I remember her very well. And I remember their wonderful, beautiful house and going to visit. Now, one of the things is that we would go for walks in the neighborhood. My grandmother had a stroke, and she was an invalid, but her mind was sharp and clear, and she had a full-time caregiver who lived there in the house. Her name was Miss Cochran. That's a whole story in herself. But we'd walk, and sometimes we'd pass a statue. And this is the statue. Now remember what a wonderful, friendly woman she was, and what she looked like. Sometimes my mother would be with me, and we'd see this statue. If you see her, she's an older woman. Oh, I don't know how well you can see it. Here, maybe that's a little bit better. She's an older woman. She's sitting there in a chair. She's got a child by her side, and she's smiling at him. And the only name on the statue is Margaret. That's all that's on. Well, that's because that's all that was needed in her day. That's the only thing people needed to know about her, that her name was Margaret. She was born in 1813 in Ireland. Her family immigrated when she was 5 years old to Baltimore. Unfortunately, though she came from a fairly good-sized family, everyone would die of an epidemic before she was 12 years old. Well, she was taken in by a friend of the family, and though she was by a friend of the family, and she ended up getting married in Baltimore at the Baltimore Cathedral. Some of y'all may be familiar with it. But unfortunately, her husband's health was not that good, and they suggested a warmer climate for him, and so they moved to New Orleans. Well, unfortunately, New Orleans didn't serve him much better. And soon he and their baby were gone. So twice Margaret's whole entire family was wiped out. Now in New Orleans, she had to support herself. Margaret could neither read nor write. And she went ahead and she managed to buy she started with a couple of cows and began to sell milk. And as she sold milk, she'd take it to the French market in New Orleans, and she'd sell it there and make her rounds. She would also collect day-old bread, and she'd bring it to the orphanages. And she began to be known as the bread lady. Well, she was very frugal, and soon she saved her money, and she invested it well, and soon she had her own dairy. And then she ended up buying a bakery, and she became known as the bread lady. And she was especially concerned about orphans. And there were many, many orphans in New Orleans in those days. Fever, disease, took so many. She ended up opening 4 orphanages. And she herself always continued to live very simply. She wore a calico bonnet, and she was quite determined, and she personally would make her rounds. They say she only owned 2 dresses, one for Sunday and one for every day of the week. And she always wore a shawl around her shoulders, like a good Irish woman, I suppose, of her day. Well, Civil War came, and New Orleans was occupied. And she gained quite a bit of fame because she absolutely insisted that she wasn't going to, she crossed back and forth across the lines. And when the Union soldiers tried to stop her from crossing over to go to the orphanages on the Confederate side, she said, they said it wasn't allowed, and it was by order of the president, they said. And she said, well, I can't believe a man like Abraham Lincoln who thinks it's so important to free the slaves would want little children to starve to death. So she whipped her horse and off across the line she went. Well, General Butler, who was the military commander of New Orleans during the occupation, called her into his office and fussed at her and told her he never wanted her to do that again without his permission. And then he wrote her a letter of permission so that she could cross freely back and forth across the lines between the Confederates. She also began to open homes for the elderly. She worked closely with all charities. It didn't matter what the religion or what the background. Protestant, Catholic, she was Catholic, but Protestant, Catholic, black, white, Jewish, Native American, it did not matter. She took care of them all. And she became extremely beloved. She actually became known for her business and her good business sense and her good old common sense, and many people would seek her out. As a matter of fact, in her final years, she would spend every day sitting. If she wasn't riding in her cart, she'd sit in the doorway of her bakery, and she would talk to anybody who wanted to talk to her. As a matter of fact, my grandfather, who was born in 1875, he actually remembered seeing her when he'd walk past with his father, and they'd see Margaret sitting there. She was so well known. Well, she died in 1882, and the whole city of New Orleans mourned. The Times-Picayune went ahead and put black around the edge of their newspaper, which they only did for like the death of extremely famous people, because she was that famous and she was quite loved. Hundreds and thousands of people packed the churches and the streets for her. For her funeral. Her body was laid in state at one of the orphanages, and people filed through to pay their respects to Margaret. As she went through the streets of the city, the whole city observed 5 minutes of mourning, and the whole city came to a stop. The governor, lieutenant governor, all those people attended her funeral. And this is a simple woman from Ireland, an Irish immigrant who could neither read nor write. But she was called, from then on, she has been called in her own lifetime the Angel of the Delta because of all her charitable works. She went a long way during the hard years to work among the poor in New Orleans. They went past the New Orleans Cotton Exchange and Stock Exchange, and they shut down trading so that everyone could file out to the streets, onto the street, out of respect when her funeral procession came by. Almost immediately after her death, they began to raise money for Margaret. And they wanted a statue. And the statue that I walked past so many times when I was a child, and still smile every time I see it, stands in front of one of the orphanages she built. in a little square called Margaret's Place. She's not been forgotten by the people of New Orleans. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, well, probably 20 years ago now, maybe longer, one of my favorite New Orleans singers, who, believe it or not, is an Irish folk singer, his name's Danny O'Flaherty, and he wrote a song about Margaret. She was just a plain, hard-working, large-hearted woman. And what I love about her is she took the pain of her life, the loss of her birth family, the loss of her husband and child, and she never let it make her bitter. She instead continued to do everything within her power to help the people whose lives she touched. When she died, they found she had quite a bit of money. She left all of it to poor children and the elderly of New Orleans. She worked very hard, and she made it clear that the money was to be given and shared among all needy people, regardless of their race, color, or creed, because they're all God's children. Right after following this, I've asked Sharman and Mary to play a video that was made for Mother's Day in 2014, honoring Margaret. Shows her statue, the one that I saw, and pictures of her from that time. One a very flattering oil portrait, and the other one a quite honest black and white photograph. But I think what I learned from her, and maybe it helped shape who I became. Because you know, the people you are told stories about, the people you come to admire, they have an effect on your life. And Margaret, somewhere in the background, I believe, was one of my heroes. I know the good that I try to do won't reach as far as Margaret's did, or have so much fame. But still in all, no matter where we are, we can still help others. I hope you enjoy the video, and until next time, God bless.